Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Smith from Austin, Texas. The information you're going to see today is strictly educational and not meant to diagnose or treat any symptoms or diseases. Thank you very much. I ran across an interesting statement by the National Institute of Health, which is something I think needs to be brought to the forefront, and that is that first time in recent history, children are expected to have a decreased life expectancy of between 5 and 20 years compared to their parents. Thank you for joining me today. Once again, I'm Dr. Brian Smith, and I'm talking to you today about something called pH acidosis disease. It's a name that I have come up with because I really believe that these symptoms are something that are involved with my patients and myself. And first of all, I want to talk about the name. First, the word disease, and the word disease has to do with the fact that the body's not at ease. Some people don't know that that's the actual what disease means. The other thing is acidosis. And when it comes to acidosis, you'll hear a lot of different things about acidosis, and one is really just how it refers to blood pH and where that number is. So if blood pH has to be about 7.4, anything 7.3 or 7.2 is an acidosis process, and it can affect the entire body. And the third thing that I want to talk about is pH. And pH is something that people will talk about, and it talks about potential hydrogen in the body. But when you think of the body is just a big bag of chemicals. It talks about an electron giver and an electron taker, and how you measure that on a logarithm scale. So those three things really affect the body. I want to talk a little bit and share with you some of my thoughts on that. Now, what I'm sharing with you has not had a true test of a lot of things, but it's for discussion, it's for education, so please keep that in mind as we go through this extensive science and biology lesson on the human body and how it refers to dentistry, because I take care of patients that some of them are chronic pain, having things called TMJ problems, and I address it in ways that has remarkable results. And it has to do with diet, and it has to do with some of my thoughts about the intake of the diet and M.S.G. So if you look at the first slide, you'll see that it says pH acidosis disease, and it's a closer look at M.S.G consumption and its toxicity and its impact on your health and global trends. So please watch and have an open mind, and let's see where this goes. Basically what happens is M.S.G is called the nicotine of foods. And when you have the nicotine of foods, once again, it's the addictive part of it, and it's also been given the acronym the Chinese headache. And so people think of it being only affecting the head, but really there's 6 phases when you eat M.S.G, and the Chinese headache is just the first phase. It's an acute phase that happens from swelling in the brain, and it just so happens that actually 10% of the society has ringing in its ears. And from my personal experience, I know that the ringing is connected to M.S.G, and it's taken me a long time to figure that out. But my testimony is that I'm very sensitive to it, and I can speak with authority about ringing in the ears and also the M.S.G headache or concussion that it's causing, also known as a Chinese headache, and a lot of people aren't aware that that's what's going on. So being a dentist, one thing that we do is take care of people, and we talk to them sincerely about nutrition, how to take care of the mouth and the teeth. And I ran across an interesting statement by the National Institute of Health, which is something I think needs to be brought to the forefront, and that is that first time in recent history, children are expected to have a decreased life expectancy of between 5 and 20 years compared to their parents. Now, if you're a parent and you have children, this should really make you pay attention, because that's something that's not said a lot about in our culture, and it needs to be brought to the forefront, and we need to find out what we need to do to address that, and not just leave it alone. So that's one of my interests here, is to see if we can have some discussion on this point. And also another thing that's close to my heart is a little bit of a story that I'd like to tell you. And so, in my discovery of looking at certain things that have to do with pain in the body and the mouth and the teeth, I found out that we have a lot of epidemics going on, and I believe that they're all related. We have an autism epidemic in this country, and if you don't see it around you, it's tremendous. It's something that's just going on, and it's just getting worse and worse on a daily basis. We have an obesity and a diabetes epidemic. those things are affecting just huge numbers of people, millions of people. We have an Alzheimer's epidemic. Alzheimer's right now is somewhere between the number 6 and number 3rd killer listed on the top 10 by the CDC. And as today, there's no known cure for it. So once the diagnosis is made, you will die with it. We have a sleep apnea epidemic going on in this country. More and more people are having breathing problems at nighttime, and it can be devastating. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And I believe that there's 2 types of sleep apnea. There's the obstructive and the non-obstructive. And I want to talk about that. All of these factors are putting stress on the family. And you can't have a heart for looking at epidemics unless you look at what's going on in the United States and the nuclear family and the statistics of divorce. It's really a terrible thing. I believe that in order to have a healthy life and a healthy marriage, you need to somehow take some of the stress out of your life, and it sometimes starts with a healthy body. And then another thing that's not talked about too much is the suicide epidemic. The CDC ranks suicides as the number 10 killer in the United States, and in a country where we're free to choose and do things, that's shameful. And I think that it also is related to some things that I want to bring up here. So all of those things I believe are interrelated and need to be discussed on an open topic. And so I hope that you bear with me, and we're going to look at some things together. Something I'd like to talk about for a moment is autism. And most people don't realize how bad it's getting in this country. If you look at this slide, you can see that post-World War II that autism was almost non-existent. And in 1975, the incidence is 1 in 5,000 births. At this point in our society, we have almost 2 out of every babies born in every hospital around the country with autism. It's just going up. And I don't hear enough discussion about some of the reasons why. There's a lot of speculation. But if you just look at the numbers, it's something that needs to be discussed quite dramatically. And if you also look at this slide, you'll see that boys have autism 5 times greater than girls. And this is something, it's a neurological disease, it's in the cranium, it's from the neck up, and there's certain instances where I believe that the brain is not getting enough oxygen, and there's the major reason why. Now this slide has to do with obesity in America, and once again, anybody who knows about obesity knows that it can be calories related to what you eat, but we're finding out that through certain studies that M.S.G can also be tied to the BMI index. And there's been certain studies now that show that M.S.G is addictive. And what happens is the more that's in your food, the more it stimulates the receptors in your tongue, known as umami receptors. There are also glutamic receptors that are tied directly to the brain, and those glutamine receptors as well. And so we have this vicious cycle going on where as we stimulate those through an action potential, we sometimes never get satiated. And it can be part of the problem with dieting in this country without exercise, thinking that diet is going to take care of things. But also it has to do with calories and how much you eat. But as you look on this slide, you can see that back in the 1960s, we had about 10% of adults were overweight, and now we're at 35.9% in just a couple of years ago, and soon to be projected in 2030, 50% of our society will be obese. And as we know, obesity is also linked to other things like heart problems and diabetes and all these problems. So if we continue along these areas, we will be basically running into the hospital, and go back to that first slide saying that we're going to have a decreased lifespan. So we need to think about how long we're going to live, not only the quantity of life, but our quality of life as well. And these things need to be addressed and need to be talked about. So another slide that I also want to show here is the diabetes that's tied to the obesity. We talked a little bit about that, but when you actually see it in numbers, it can have a huge impact on you. If you look at 1958, and we're having about 1% of the number of people with diabetes, and you see it escalate since World War II we are increasing up to the 7 and 8%, and it's soon to be 10%. And if you think of an entire society of 250 million or 300 million people, with 1% having diabetes, that's an astronomical number. And to try to think of the rest of society who's going to take care of that society, of that group of individuals, it's a huge burden on everybody, as well as the difficulties of having the diabetes itself and all of the other things that go along with it. And so when you look at numbers of people, we also look in the millions of people. Here we're talking 18, 20 million known people to have diabetes, which is just an astronomical number, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now this slide also talks about the number of overweight children around the world. And if you look at the USA, which is the purple line, you can see that we actually lead the world in overweight children. And this is really disheartening. If you go back, once again, if we extrapolate this all the way back to World War II, you would see that obesity and overweight was really not a problem. But now we're starting to get, once again, in the 30, 35, 40% range, and it's just becoming a problem. And I do not see anywhere in the media or in our healthcare fields where it's a public issue. Now it might be a private issue, but because of the sensitivity of it, it needs to be more publicized. And I believe that the dental offices can be a good place to talk about this, because when it comes to long-term relationships, we seem to have as much of a relationship as kids grow up as anybody, and nutrition can be a good part of that, or also tied in with the medical offices so that we can do it together. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed across the board so that everybody can benefit. If you look at the worldwide diabetes, it's astronomical too. So we're looking at 300 million people around the world with diabetes. But look at the chart. Anybody knows anything about charts? If we take these charts and set them on top of each other and extrapolate them back to the 1940s and 50s, you'll see that it wasn't a problem. And what the real awakening here should be, that it's not going down, it's only going up. And so the chances of you getting diabetes or your family guy getting diabetes are just going up and up and up. And anybody who knows what that disease does should be scared, and they should make behavioral changes to change themselves and take responsibility for what they're putting in their mouth and how it affects their body. And it's just something we need to talk about. If you look at the extent Alzheimer's has been going up since World War II, it did exist before that, but the huge increase in it has to do with after World War II. And if we look at the diet since then, one of the things that really bothers me is how much natural flavoring, M.S.G, glutamic acid, and all these things are in the food. And in later discussions, we'll find out how those things cause the brain to get in cycles and not be able to release the materials that allows people to think well. And so you're just burning the brain up by it overreacting from the glutamine receptors in the brain and causing it to overheat. And as people age, and I'll show you that later, as we age, the glutathione in the liver becomes less and less and less. So people have less ability to detox these food additives that are in there, and the septic that's happening to the body is showing up in this now killer that's a number 3 or number 6 on the scale of people that are past the age where their livers can take care of this material. This is a slide that I got off of the internet, and I believe it's public information, and it talks about the stomach and how the stomach and what's called Helicobacter pylori are affecting the stomach. But I brought it because of stomach cancer, because I just had a friend who died with esophageal cancer. And if you look at esophageal cancer, if you go back to the 1950s, you'll see that it almost didn't exist. And we have gastric reflux, GERD, in this country, which is an epidemic. And we're using way too many proton pump inhibitors to try to keep that acid down. But if you look at the H. pylori infections, and those are going down, and they are a part of a natural biological system that creates the urea that when the body creates this hydrochloric acid to to digest food with its proteases and things of that nature. It needs to go back to a normal place. And I believe that a lot of the food that we're using today has such a low pH, especially the sodas in the 2 and 3 and 4 range. They have that low pH because of the artificial flavoring that's in there, and the shelf life is needed to drive that pH down so that it can stay on the stores. Because if you take that same shelf life for that flavoring, the shelf life is maybe 1 or 2 days, 48 hours. And so that artificial flavoring that's going into the stomach with the low pHs is destroying the stomach's ability to turn on and off, and we're getting gastric GERD and acid reflux, which is then splashing up on the throat. And now we have this huge exponential climb in Barrett's esophagus and esophageal cancer. And I believe that this needs to be talked about. Niels Bohr, a famous scientist, came up with many of the things that we use today, and one of them is called the Bohr effect. And the Bohr effect actually talks about how your body gets oxygen through the body, through the cells to get it to work. And the hemoglobin on the red blood cells are actually the part of the cell that carries oxygen. And when you look at cellular biology, you'll notice that as pH goes down, particularly arterial blood pH, the hemoglobin is less saturated. And the difference between a 7.4 saturation and a 7.2 saturation, 7.4 being normal, and that would be a normal graph, and 7.2 as your body gets more and more acidic from the stomach, not turning on and off correctly. And when the stomach doesn't turn on and off correctly, it's not producing the bicarbonate that the blood needs to buffer itself. So it becomes more acidic, and your hemoglobin carries less oxygen. So a lot of our systemic problems are due to the fact that we're not getting oxygen to the rest of our body as needed. And so a lot of times, if you think about someone who's pregnant and trying to have a child, and that individual is going from 2 cells to a 7 or 8 pound baby, you're looking at a multi-billion% increase, and all of that takes oxygen, all it takes glucose. And if the mother is not carrying or has a low oxygen deficiency due to a low blood pH from the stomach not turning on and off or getting the bicarbonate to buffer the system, then you'll have neurological or neurodegenerative diseases. And I think that a lot of that is how we're seeing our symptoms go up and up and up in autism and other things. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as a systemic type problem. And to drive this point home, this is a picture of trees, healthy trees that were probably, 60, 80, 100 feet tall, and they died from acid rain. And so if you just look at what the acidity will do to something, so from a healthy, normal plant in this case, you can think about what acidity does to our bodies. And also that acidity, when it gets into the system, nothing works very well. And when you have a plant that has a system in it where it goes up and down due to the water, you can see what it's doing there. So we should take a look at that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this is affecting our bodies and our water supplies, the acid in the water supplies and the acid of the stomach, and what it's doing to the body. I want to tie it all together, some of the things I've talked about with symptoms of acidosis. And one of the things about symptoms of acidosis is it's very much like a concussion. And if I was in a car wreck or got hit real hard with a football injury, you would notice that you would have a headache and you would be drowsy, you would be sleepy, you'd be confused, and it can really go loss of consciousness. Well, these are all symptoms of acidosis, and you have the acute symptoms and you have chronic symptoms. And the acutest symptoms happen really from the neck up, and the chronic symptoms happen from the neck down. And so as I talk a little bit about acidosis and how it affects people, you might think a little bit about the Chinese headache that's caused by M.S.G, but also sleepiness after lunch in class, or sleepiness after stopping and getting quick food at a fast food restaurant and trying to drive and getting abnormally sleepy after that.
I know a lot of people talk about the glucose levels in the blood. That can also be associated with it, but you've got to understand that MSG, when it's put with caffeine, caffeine is a stimulant, and it's trying to offset that that result, which is basically a depressive type of sleepiness, with the caffeine. And so those two things are brought together in drinks a lot and in food a lot, and without the caffeine you would see the results a lot more. So caffeine really masks a lot of the MSG that we're finding in our foods, which is causing the toxicity, which is causing the suffocation effects of hypoxia, and mainly cerebral hypoxia when it's happening in the head. So I'm using this slide also to talk about chronic type of acidosis. And if you look at the center of the slide, you'll see what's called normal blood pH in the 7.4 level. And as you move that blood pH to your left, you'll see when blood pH goes to 7.3, your acidosis is a process, and you're going down to 7.2, you start seeing the systemic types of acidosis, which are both metabolic acidosis and respiratory acidosis. And these things, once again, when they happen, they can be tied to the stomach and the turning on and off. There's other things that cause acidosis for sure, and there can be all kinds of things that cause those. So I'm not dispelling any of the other normal things that cause it. I'm just trying to tie together some of the symptoms with the food we eat, and how long it takes, and the toxicity of the blood pH, and how the cumulative effect of those things are causing some of these, and how it's all tied together. Another thing I'd like to talk about is the hidden names that commercial foods are using for MSG and glutamic acid. And they're using them in such a way that they should not be used, without any truth in labeling. And one of the things about MSG is, because glutamic acid is one of the twin key amino acids that we use in our body to make proteins, if you take and put sodium on it and call it monosodium glutamate, then it can be considered organic, when really it is not organic. It by no means is organic. And we're seeing a lot of things labeled organic and they're not. And this cumulative effect, when you look on labels, you'll see it as natural and artificial flavors, which is a huge labeling, and we need more truthful labeling so that we actually know what that content is, instead of it just being hidden in there. And if you look at labels, you'll see the proportionality of the things that are on labels. So it's even, if you look at dog foods and other things, you'll see that some of these epidemics are going right along with it, because we're adding it in the pet food too. But also, you want, if it says natural flavors, to be down at the end and not at the top. And because the more that's in there, it's harder for your body to get rid of. But also, things like spices and the breads have it. It's called malted barley flavor. And all of these things, enzymes and cheeses, and anything like whey, which is glutamic acid, and you got to know that glutamic acid is a major form of protein, so it's in most food you eat, and it being a non-essential amino acid means that your body can produce it. So the question is, why are we putting so many things in our body that the body can produce when it really doesn't need it? So this next slide is a slide that I'm proposing that talks about the toxicity of MSG in our food. And I've developed it, and I believe that we have septic limits in our body, and there's a cumulative effect that's going on every day around the country because of the amount of food that has commercially produced MSG toxins in it. And in the equation, you'll see on the left-hand side that septic toxic limit, I'm calling F, is a cumulative amount, and that's just a little bit in everything you eat. And what happens is, depending on your age, how much you exercise, your health, how well your liver can detox with things called glutathione, they all come into effect, as well as your medical sensitivity, because I do not believe that genetically everybody has the same reactions, much like some people are more reactive to peanuts or strawberries or figs, and there's just a sensitivity there, and you're seeing it in the symptoms of certain people, and I'm going to point that out also. And also, when it gets to the amount of exercise that you have. There's also in the pH, we have to discuss polarity of neutrons and action potential. And I know these are things that we really don't need to talk about in length right now, but if you continue watching this web series, you'll learn and find out more about what questions you can ask of yourself and what you can do and see the results for lowering your pain levels, and also looking at the way that you just become more healthy through what you eat. This last slide that I'm showing may or may not be pertinent to the information, but I wanted to throw it in here because it has to do another post-World War II slide. And I like to think of bees as colonies of individuals and how they work together and do things together, and we call them worker bees. And there just has something called a colony collapse disease. And in colony collapse disease, it's still not understood exactly what happens yet, but beekeepers know that sometimes you can go out to a beehive and one day you have thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of bees working for the queen, and they're doing all their daily things. And you open it up and all the worker bees are gone, and the queen is sitting there and just the box all by herself. And my theory is that because we have put M.S.G into a lot of the sodas and the drinks, that you'll go into a department store or something like that, and where people drop their drinks, you'll see the bees go in there, and they want the sugar or the nectar instead of going to the flowers because it's an easy source of them to do that. And as they put that into their hives or their homes, they start to see the pupa, as they are beginning that new life cycle, come up with a lot of the problems that I think we have, and the excitotoxicity and the neuron death that they see. And when they have that, I think that they pick up and move. Now that may or may not be a valid point, but it's a point for discussion that I would like to see if we could have more discussion on that and see if it actually is a true thing or not.